Can there be such a thing as a good death? Can there be such a thing as a good death? For those who have lost a loved one, it is almost impossible to imagine a good death. These past few weeks, following the shooting at Chardon High, many people have mourned the tragic death of 3 bright, promising young people and the wounding of others. And sorrow and outrage has mounted following the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, a similarly bright and promising young 17-year-old Florida high school student, the night before the Chardon shootings in Sanford, Florida. And while much needs to be learned about the motives and the culpabilities of these shooters, it is clear, to me at least, these deaths were not good. I believe that no death is ever good. It just becomes more crystal clear when we're speaking about the death of a young person who is cut down in their prime, as we are prone to say. Yet I believe that even the death of an elderly person who has lived a long, rewarding, and full life, who dies peacefully in the middle of his or her sleep, in the middle of the night, even that death, I believe, is not to be called good, although it may be welcome and it may even be right. The death of any one of God's children is never good. We were created to have life and to have it abundantly. Therefore, I find some of the things Jesus says very hard to take and difficult to swallow. It's troublesome, even angry, when Jesus talks about death. Especially when you set it against the news stories of the last few weeks. There's so many places where Jesus talks about death. His death, the disciples' death, our deaths. In a way that seems to indicate that death might not just be inevitable, but somehow good and worthy. Is that what Jesus is saying? Today's text is a disconcerting discourse on death. And the entire season of Lent, and always has been, this kind of fervor as it talks about what death is. It lifts up and sanctifies Jesus' death. Why? Why? Surely his death was not a good death. Jesus' allegory about a grain of wheat falling into the ground and dying, he uses as an allegory about his own impending death. And then he admonishes his followers that those who love their life will lose it. And those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. It is hard to see anything else in these words but somehow supporting death. Even if that death is an act of faith. If I were the parents and friends of the students in Chardon, or Trayvon's mother and father in church on this Sunday, and I heard the words that Colleen read today, I might rightfully be enraged by the implication that the death of their loved ones might be necessary, or might have a purpose, or God forbid, might even be good. You tell that to the moms and the dads and the friends. But this question about God's intentions for death has long been a theological conundrum for persons of all faiths. The meaning of death is explored in the entire biblical canon, from the first few chapters when God warns Adam and Eve in the story of Genesis that eating from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil would certainly result in death, to the promise far off in Revelation as the holy city comes down from heaven, that God will wipe every tear from their eyes, and death finally will be no more. The entire biblical canon is dealing with the issue of life and death. And theological discussions have ranged throughout Christendom. Everything from deep, hard-to-read tomes from Augustine and Calvin and Barth to the simplistic platitudes that you all hear after a funeral. You know, we do this kind of quick theologizing because we don't know what to do. Well, I guess God must have needed one more angel in heaven. Not my angel! This isn't theoretical. Just recently had a conversation with a young woman who's still struggling with the death of a family member long past. That's the very question. Not my angel! I cannot believe that Jesus intended his words to be used to justify death, anyone's death, even his own. Because if we take Scripture seriously and hear Jesus say, "Whoever serves me must follow me, and wherever I am, there will my servants be also," would have to understand that what is good for Jesus is good for us too. If we take following Jesus with all the good stuff, you know, feeding the hungry and welcoming the children and healing the sick, then we're going to have to take the difficult stuff too, meaning following him to the cross and dying. And certainly this is the way all of Christianity has interpreted Jesus' words. That following Jesus means following him in his life and his death. The Apostle Paul, in his epistle to the Philippians, proclaims, "Now it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be put to shame in any way, but that by my speaking with all boldness, Christ will be exalted now as always in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Paul was willing to follow Jesus to the cross. There's a long history of Christian martyrs who have done the very same thing, who've taken Jesus at his word and followed him to their deaths. From several of the disciples themselves to the great martyrs of the early church, including Felicitas and Perpetua, to the martyrs of the 20th century, including Archbishop Oscar Romero, there have been many who have believed that their deaths, often in response to their faithful following of Christ throughout their lives, would not simply be an act of devotion to him, but it would be a good death. What if Jesus meant something different? Not that we shouldn't live our lives in such a way that Jesus and the faith of Jesus is so ingrained in our very way of being that we can't imagine forsaking him even unto death. No, I'm not saying that that is bad. But what if Jesus meant not that death itself was good, but the act of giving ourselves up to death is good? The idea here is, what if in preparing ourselves as if we were ready to die for Jesus, that in the preparation something happens inside of us? What if the goodness does not come from the dying, but from letting ourselves go? So that we can say confidently with Paul, "So whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's." What would it mean to live life at every moment as if you could and would be willing to give it up and be okay, deep down in the cells of your soul, okay with death? What would it take for all of us to get to that place? In my Bible study class in New York City, we had a phrase after several years that we decided was the summation of every biblical passage that we ever studied. Everything seemed to come down to the phrase, let go and let go. So what do I do when I'm in a quandary about my sermon? I post something on Facebook. So I asked my Facebook community a question, and I thought it was a bit of a risk to ask such a serious question. I asked, what do you give up in order to have new life? And I'd like for you all to think about that. We all know what we're yearning for, that new life that's ahead of us. Some of us may have it realized a little more in this moment. Some of us may have no idea what new life feels like. What do we have to give up in order to have new life? And I received some pretty honest and powerful responses. In the first set were kind of the ones that you would expect, those negative things, the things that we know we need to give up. Perfectionism, control, worry, fear, power, apprehension, the belief that I'm not good enough, the belief that I don't belong, the shoulda, coulda, wouldas, the belief that I'm not worthy, the belief that I am something over above someone else, the personal desires but not passions. But then some more positive things came up that I didn't expect. People felt that in order to have new life, they needed to give up friends, old habits, dwelling, freedom, peace, love, comfort, people, friends, and associates. Such a broad mixture of folks' lives that they felt they needed to give up in order to receive new life. Maybe my Facebook community knew more about this giving up than I did. But it seemed to be summed up in one of my clergy colleagues' statement, who probably knew what text I was preaching on, when she wrote, "Giving up the life we have, surrender as a seed surrenders to the soil." Yeah, I'm thinking that's the secret. That's the difference between a bad death or even a good death, which I think is impossible, and a death that may just bring about goodness, which is what Jesus was calling to. It's more about surrendering, letting go, than going out and committing harikari or even suicide. It's more about the letting go that prepares our hearts and our minds for whatever may come. And such letting go can be found best in the symbol Jesus gave us, the seed. He gave us a grain of wheat as his seed of poetic choice. But then we all know that Jesus had a real thing about wheat and bread and those kinds of things, didn't he? He reminds us what we already know, that unless a grain of seed, a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it does, it bears much fruit. Now, we know what Jesus knew, that a seed doesn't truly die when it goes into the ground. It just looks that way. But we also know, like the kids knew, it's not alive either. It could sit there forever. If a seed is not dead and not alive, then what is it? I think the seed is encrypted with the code for life. A seed is not life itself, but it is so imbued with the essence of what life is that it cannot die, even when it falls to the ground. And Jesus says that it has to die in that way for that deep code of life to be unlocked in order to bring new life, fruit, as Jesus says. We must die in just such a way. First, this kind of dying means that we have to live life first. We can't die if we haven't known life. We must live life that is rich and full of all the joys and sorrows, all the possibilities and loves and losses and wisdom that we can possibly soak up from life. Jesus did. He went both to weddings and funerals. He ate dinner with gusto. He slept soundly. He went to worship gladly. He visited friends, debated with the pompous, and prayed passionately. In the words of the country and western song that I overuse too much, I know, Jesus envisioned what it would mean for us to live like we were dying. So first we must live. And second, we must let go. For Jesus, this kind of dying meant that he had to offer up his life to the principalities and powers of this world. The very principalities and powers he knew were threatened by the very rabble-rousing, woman-honoring, poor-provoking, blind-healing, outcast-welcoming, foreigner-friendly, let-the-children-speak-listening life that Jesus lived. And by letting go of the need to hold on to this rich, amazing, wonderful life of his, by letting go, he knew that the out-of-control, power-hungry folks in charge, like the shooters in Chardon and Sanford, would react the way they always do, out of violence, born of fear and insecurity. But Jesus gave it up anyway, because he was so certain that the seed would sprout again. I'm one of those theologians who does not believe for a minute that God intended for Jesus to die. I know I go against a great deal of Christian theology, and forgive me, but the classic atonement theory, at least offered by most Christian theologians, does nothing for me. I am one of the theologians that believes, however, that the sad state of human affairs, our free will and our ego, is a sign of God's letting go and surrender. Means that when goodness gets out of hand, it is inevitable that someone will behave badly. For Jesus, those someones were the Roman government and a small group of religious leaders who had sacrificed their faith in order to have the good graces of the emperor keep them in the lifestyle to which they had grown accustomed. But in every day, in every society, our own included, there are those who act out of fear and faith, who are threatened by those who are able to let go and let God, who seek to destroy the goodness that might call them to both accountability and new life. There is no such thing as a good death, beloved. I do believe, however, wholeheartedly, that each and every one of us is presented with the possibility of our death leading to goodness. That fruit can come from our death. How is that possible? Well, some of the process is out of our control. Let's be honest. We must rely on the fickle forces of nature and history. But a great deal of the essence of goodness from our death can come because of how we've lived life in the first place. We must live life fully, knowing that God alone is the source of our life. But we must also live life fully by being willing to let it go. That is the glory of letting go. Letting go of all those things that keeps us from being ourselves. The fear, the anger, the selfishness, the pride, all that. But to live a life rich with the chances for goodness, we must also be able to give up the good things of life. Which is to be open to the truth that the only good thing in life ultimately, that was there before we were born, and will be there long after we die, is God and God alone. The only good thing throughout all of this, living and dying, is God. So we must trust as the little seed trust patiently, sometimes for thousands of years. We must trust that whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. May it be so.